Welcome, friends. The storm outside is fierce tonight, the thunder cracking like a warning. But here, within these words, I have a story, a gift for you, a gift that will guide you through the dark, calm your mind, and help you drift off to sleep. Despite the storm's roar, just remember, the rain might be scary, but you're safe here. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that bell, so you never miss the next tale. Now close your eyes and let's begin. Dr. David Miller had always found comfort in the quiet solitude of the morgue. The pathologist's office was a place where the rest of the hospital's chaos seemed to fade away. No interruptions, no beeping machines or ringing phones. Just him, his instruments, and the bodies of those who had passed, waiting to tell their stories. It had been the same for years. The routine was comforting: autopsies, dissection, and meticulous examinations. Dr. Miller was an expert in his field, one of the most respected in the hospital. And yet, despite the clinical, sterile environment, he couldn't shake the strange feeling that something was amiss in the morgue. For months, it had been easy to ignore. Just a faint buzzing in the back of his mind, the occasional creak of a drawer, the faintest draft that felt colder than it should. But one night, things changed. He'd just finished an autopsy on an unknown Jane Doe, the body still lying in front of him under the harsh, cold light of the morgue. As he cleaned up, preparing to leave for the night, something caught his attention, a faint murmur. At first, he thought it was his mind playing tricks on him. The dead don't speak, after all. But the murmur grew louder, clearer, and then it stopped. David shook his head, trying to brush it off, but the unease lingered. Over the next few nights, the whispers returned, soft, almost imperceptible. He couldn't pinpoint where they were coming from. Were the bodies trying to communicate with him? It was absurd, impossible, but he couldn't deny what he was hearing. And then one night, the whispers stopped being random. They began to form words, phrases, fragments of sentences that David could understand. Pleas, desperate cries for help, silent voices from the past. The last straw came when David found a body that wasn't in the morgue's records. A man who shouldn't have been there at all, with no name, no history. And when the whispers began again, louder this time, urgent, almost frantic, David knew he couldn't ignore them any longer. Something was hidden here in the morgue, something dark, and the bodies. They weren't just waiting to be forgotten, they were waiting to be heard. The nights in the morgue felt colder than they ever had before. Dr. David Miller had worked countless late shifts, but now, as he stood in the sterile, cold room surrounded by the bodies of the deceased, an undeniable sense of unease gripped him. The whispers had started again, softer at first, then more distinct, as though the bodies themselves were trying to reach out to him. It started the same way it always did, a low murmur that made him pause, his scalpel still in mid-air as he worked on a routine autopsy. He shook his head, trying to focus on the task at hand, but the whispers came again, louder this time. Help, please. The voice was faint but unmistakable, like a soft plea floating through the cold air. David's heartbeat quickened, and for a moment, he wondered if his mind was playing tricks on him. He had always been a skeptic, grounded in facts and science. The idea that the dead could speak was something he couldn't accept. But this felt different. The room seemed to grow colder still, as if the very walls were closing in on him. He wiped his forehead, feeling a bead of sweat despite the chill. The whispering didn't stop. It wasn't an accident. David stepped back from the body he had been working on, his hands shaking. He stared at the cooling corpse in front of him. The voice hadn't come from a machine. There were no alarms, no sounds of malfunction, just whispers. And it wasn't the first time. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. This wasn't possible. The bodies in the morgue had no voices, no lives left to speak. He was just imagining things, wasn't he? But the whispers were becoming clearer, more insistent. You need to find the truth. The man, he didn't die from what they say. David's eyes widened. He'd heard that phrase before, buried deep in the notes of several past cases. He didn't die from what they say. Was it a coincidence, or was there something more sinister lurking beneath the surface? He glanced over at the row of bodies lined up in the refrigerated drawers. His gaze fell on one in particular, an unidentified man, around the age of 40. His file was thin, nothing remarkable about him. But now, in the eerie silence of the morgue, David couldn't help but feel like he was missing something. The whispers had grown more persistent, and as he stared at the body of the unknown man, the whispers intensified. It was murder. Find the truth. He didn't die of natural causes. David's hands shook as he reached for the file, flipping through the sparse documents. The cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest, due to undiagnosed heart disease. But something about the way the whispers described it felt wrong, too clean, too neat. He quickly glanced at the name on the file again. John Doe. David frowned. He'd seen too many John Does in his time at the hospital, but something about this one made his stomach twist. This man didn't belong in the morgue, under such vague circumstances. He had been treated. The last entry in the log showed that John Doe had been admitted after a brief episode of chest pain, but there was no further follow-up. David's mind raced. He had to investigate further. He had to understand why the whispers were so urgent. The thought of letting it go was unbearable. The feeling of not knowing what happened was gnawing at him. He couldn't shake the suspicion that the morgue wasn't just a place for the dead. It was a place of secrets, secrets that wanted to be uncovered. As he carefully unzipped the body bag to examine the remains more closely, David's heart skipped a beat. The body John Doe had been moved. He stared at the incision on the chest, clean and precise. But it wasn't his incision. It was older, far more professional. Someone had dissected this body before he had. A cold wave of realization crashed over him. The whispers weren't just from the deceased. They were guiding him, leading him toward something darker, something far more sinister. Find the truth. The voice came again, louder now, more urgent. David's breath quickened. He quickly gathered his tools, his mind working at full speed. He needed to know what had happened to John Doe. Why had someone tampered with his body before him? The whispers faded, but a sickening chill remained in the room, like the air itself was tainted with something wrong, something unnatural. The truth was out there, hidden in the morgue shadows, and David Miller would stop at nothing to uncover it. David couldn't shake the growing unease, gnawing at him. The more he examined John Doe's body, the more questions surfaced. Who had touched it before? Who had altered the autopsy before he even had a chance to begin? His mind was racing. As a pathologist, he had always trusted the system. He trusted the files, the records, the hospital's procedures. But now, as he stood in the morgue, staring at the body of a man who didn't belong there, the whole foundation of what he knew felt shaky. The whispers had quieted for the moment, but they hadn't left him. They lingered in the back of his mind, faint but persistent. He grabbed his phone and made a call to the hospital's records department, his fingers tapping the desk anxiously. He needed to know more about John Doe, who had been involved with his case. Why was the autopsy log so incomplete? A few moments later, the voice on the other end of the line answered, "Records Department. How can I help you?" The voice was indifferent, routine. "Hi," David said, trying to sound professional but feeling his voice waver. "I need to pull the full records for a John Doe patient ID, #85329. I'm doing an autopsy and noticed some discrepancies." There was a pause on the other end. The silence was too long. "Sorry, Dr. Miller, but there's no record for a John Doe with that ID number." David frowned. "What do you mean there's no record? I'm looking at his body right now. The autopsy log from his initial intake shows an incomplete file." The voice was hesitant. "I'm sorry, but the system shows no ID. No record under that name. Are you sure you're looking at the right case?" David's frustration began to boil over. "This doesn't make any sense. I'm holding the body right now. I'm about to perform the autopsy on it. How can you have no record for him?" There was a long pause before the voice on the other end spoke again, this time quieter. "Dr. Miller, there's no John Doe in the morgue. Not for that ID number. The body's been moved." David's pulse spiked, the whispering in his mind returning, louder now. "It's not just the body." The thought was jarring. "What do you mean moved?" he asked, his voice tight with disbelief. "The body you're referring to isn't on our official morgue list. It hasn't been for the last 5 years. The only log we have for the name John Doe was a case from 5 years ago." David's heart skipped a beat. 5 years ago? That's the same time period we're dealing with now. "Yes." The voice sounded almost nervous, but the file was closed back then. "There's no follow-up, just a mysterious death. Nothing about a second autopsy, or any of the other details you're asking about. The body was removed from the morgue, but the records aren't clear about who took it." The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. The hospital was hiding something, and whatever it was, it involved John Doe. It involved a death, a body, and a secret that had been buried deep in the hospital's files. David slammed the phone down, his thoughts racing. He had to get to the bottom of this. Whatever had happened to John Doe 5 years ago wasn't just an unsolved mystery. It was something darker, something that had been deliberately erased. He couldn't shake the image of the body, lying on the autopsy table, the cold, lifeless expression on the man's face. Who had removed the body? Who had interfered with the autopsy before him? The whispers in his mind were no longer just echoes. They were starting to make sense. David quickly checked the morgue's other records, each one now more suspicious than the last. But there was no pattern, no connection, just a web of cases and missing files. Then he stumbled upon something that made his blood run cold. A name that wasn't supposed to be there. Dr. Thomas Harlow. David didn't recognize the name at first, but as he read the entry, the pieces began to fall into place. Dr. Harlow had been a well-respected physician in the hospital, once known for his work with cardiac patients, but he had disappeared, vanished, without explanation, just over 5 years ago. The whispers seemed to intensify, urging him forward. They wanted him to see it all. They wanted him to know the truth. David's hands trembled as he pulled up Dr. Harlow's personal files, desperate to find some clue, something that connected him to John Doe. His breath hitched as he skimmed the pages. It wasn't just a medical file. Dr. Harlow had been involved in research. experimental research on the limits of human survival. According to the files, he had been conducting unauthorized tests, pushing the boundaries of death and life, manipulating the time between life and death, but the project had been shut down. The investigation into his disappearance had led nowhere, and the case was quietly closed. But David now understood. Harlow had been experimenting with death, manipulating the very essence of life. And John Doe, he wasn't a simple case of an unidentified man. He was the product of Dr. Harlow's experiments. David's chest tightened. "What the hell have you done, Harlow?" he whispered to himself. He had to find out more. The truth was buried somewhere within the depths of the morgue's records, and the bodies, the whispering voices began to rise again, louder and more frantic now. "You know what happened. Find us. Find the truth." The whispers weren't just about John Doe anymore. They were about every patient who had been experimented on, every person whose death had been manipulated, twisted, altered. They were all waiting, urging David to find them, to uncover the truth of Dr. Harlow's dark legacy. He had no choice now. He had to find the missing pieces of the puzzle. Whatever Dr. Harlow had done, whatever had happened to those bodies, it wasn't over, and the hospital's past wasn't finished with David Miller yet. David Miller stood frozen in the dimly lit records room, the weight of the discovery crashing down on him. Dr. Harlow's name, the file, the research, everything was connected. He had been part of something much darker than just simple medical malpractice. It was worse. It was a series of twisted experiments, all hidden behind layers of lies and erased evidence. The whispers grew louder in his mind, their urgency almost deafening now. "You're close, closer than you know. Uncover the rest. Find the truth." He shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. He couldn't let himself get lost in the voices. He had to stay grounded. He had to understand what happened here, what had happened to these people. He walked briskly down the hallway toward the morgue again. The echo of his footsteps, the only sound in the otherwise silent corridor. The quiet was oppressive, like the walls were watching him, pressing in closer with each step. He wasn't sure how much time he had, or even if he could trust his own mind anymore. But he couldn't turn back. The truth was buried here, in the bones of the dead. He stepped into the morgue, the familiar cold air greeting him like an old friend. The faint scent of antiseptic and decay clung to the room, but it didn't bother him as much as it once had. There was something more pressing now. David approached the cold storage drawers. It's something more pressing now. They were all labeled, all neatly organized, but his gaze fixed on the one at the very end of the row, the one with a tag reading, "Unidentified male, cause of death, unknown." The body he had been working on earlier, John Doe, was still there, but it wasn't the body he was worried about now. It was what he would find next. The whispers in the room seemed to increase in volume, swirling around him like a breeze, urging him forward. He slowly opened the drawer and pulled out the body, carefully unwrapping it. Nothing had changed. John Doe's body was still lifeless, cold and pale, but there was something in the way it felt, different somehow, like it was no longer just a body, but something alive. David closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in deeply. He could almost feel it, the presence in the room, the unmistakable feeling that something was watching him, something dead, something that wasn't quite gone. He glanced back at the table. His hands reached instinctively for the patient's file again, flipping through the pages to find the missing details, the connections that had been erased. But the name on the record, John Doe, was still the same. There was no real information, no family, no next of kin, nothing, but the file felt wrong. There was an unmarked section on the page, a place that should have been filled with notes, and yet it was blank. Nothing but a faint, barely noticeable stain, a smear of ink. David leaned in closer, tracing his fingers along the paper. He could almost feel the outline of something hidden. He pulled the paper from the file, holding it up to the light. It was a symbol, faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A circle with intricate lines drawn inside. It looked like a mark of some sort, and it was attached to the body. The man who had been experimented on. David's heart skipped a beat. "What is this?" David whispered aloud, feeling the weight of his own voice as it echoed in the silence. The whispering became a chant. "Find it, find the truth." David stood still, unable to breathe. His eyes darted to the corner of the morgue. There, where the shadows were thickest, he swore he saw something, someone, a shadowy figure, almost transparent, standing at the edge of the room. His breath caught. It was him, Harlow. David recognized the silhouette instantly. But this wasn't real. It couldn't be. He had already vanished 5 years ago. He had disappeared without a trace. But the figure didn't move, just stood there, silent, watching. David swallowed, heart pounding, and approached cautiously. Every step felt like it was dragging him deeper into the darkness. The figure flickered in and out of the shadows, its form becoming more defined as he got closer. He reached out a trembling hand. The figure turned its head, slowly, deliberately. It wasn't Dr. Harlow anymore. It was someone else. The face was familiar. David recoiled, suddenly, overwhelmed. It wasn't Dr. Harlow who was standing in front of him. It was John Doe, the man who had died, the body in front of him, the one he had been examining. The man was alive, or at least, not entirely dead. David whispered, his voice cracked and strained. "What do you want from me?" John Doe's lips didn't move, but his voice, the voice that had been haunting David's thoughts, came through clearly. "You know what happened." David stumbled back, his hand gripping the counter. He couldn't breathe. His mind was racing, trying to piece everything together, but the words didn't make sense. The figure in front of him, the corpse, hadn't been dead. He had been altered, changed. Something had been done to him. And then everything clicked. The whispers, the bodies, the experiments. Dr. Harlow wasn't just performing regular autopsies. He was creating something. He was tampering with life, using his position in the morgue to test boundaries, to create an army of the undead, powered by his twisted vision of life after death. David took a step back. The room felt colder now, the shadows deeper. His mind was racing, trying to piece together everything he had uncovered. This wasn't just a case of a missing doctor or an unsolved death. This was something much darker. The body in front of him, the John Doe, wasn't just dead. He was a part of something far larger, and now David had become part of it too. The whispers weren't just for John Doe. They were for everyone who had died in this place, for everyone who had been lost. David had awakened something, and now the dead weren't just waiting to be heard. They were waiting for their vengeance. David stood frozen in place, the chill in the air wrapping around him like a heavy cloak. His heart pounded in his chest, and his breath came in shallow gasps. He had seen enough. The truth was no longer just buried in the morgue files or whispered by the dead. It was standing right in front of him. John Doe, or whatever this thing was, wasn't a man who had simply passed away. He was alive, but not in the way David understood. He was a creation, a byproduct of Dr. Harlow's twisted experiments on life and death. And the worst part was, David was beginning to realize that he was now part of it, caught in a web that he didn't know how to escape. John Doe's eyes, empty and hollow, locked onto David. There was something haunting in them, something that made David want to look away, but he couldn't. "Why did you come back?" David asked, his voice strained with fear and disbelief. "What do you want from me?" John Doe didn't answer. Instead, his mouth opened slightly, and a soft whisper came through. "It's time for you to understand. It's time for you to see what we've become." The figure raised a hand, pointing toward the far corner of the morgue. David followed his gaze, and his eyes widened. In the dark corner of the room, a figure began to emerge from the shadows. At first, it was just a silhouette, but then it grew clearer, more defined. It was another body, another figure that shouldn't have been there. David's stomach twisted. It wasn't just John Doe anymore. The body in the corner was a woman, pale, lifeless, with bruises along her neck. Her cause of death was obvious, but there was something different about her, something that sent a jolt of terror through David. Her eyes were wide open, staring blankly, but not vacant. Her pupils were moving, tracking David's every move. "You're starting to see it." John Doe's voice whispered again, this time from behind David. "We're all here. We were never allowed to leave. And neither will you." David spun around, his eyes frantic as he tried to make sense of everything. "What is this? Why are they here?" His voice cracked with the panic building in his chest. John Doe's lips curled into an unsettling, empty smile. "This place is more than just a morgue. It's where we stay, and where we come back. The dead don't leave here, not when Harlow's experiments have reached this point. You see, David, once you enter the cycle, it never ends." David's hands clenched into fists. The walls of the morgue seemed to close in around him. The whispering voices were now louder, more insistent, pushing him to the edge of his sanity. But then, the air shifted. A sudden, overwhelming pressure pressed down on David's chest, making it harder to breathe. The temperature dropped again, the room turning so cold that David could see his own breath. "Stop! Just stop!" David shouted, his voice hoarse as he stumbled backward. But the shadows didn't stop moving. They closed in on him. The bodies were beginning to stir, their forms twitching, their eyes flicking open, slowly, deliberately. The whispers were all around him now, louder, more frenzied. It wasn't just John Doe's voice. It was everyone. Every patient, every soul trapped within the walls of the morgue. "Join us, Doctor Miller," they chanted, their voices blending together into one unified cry. "You're one of us now. You've always been one of us." David felt his knees weaken, the weight of their words crashing down on him. His mind was spiraling. The truth he had uncovered was too much, too dark. John Doe stepped closer, his movements unnervingly smooth. "You knew, didn't you?" he asked, his voice cold and knowing. "You've been part of this place longer than you think. It's not just about the dead, Dr. Miller. It's about the ones who keep them here." David's breath caught in his throat as he remembered the strange mark he had seen in Dr. Harlow's records, the symbol, the one that seemed to be attached to John Doe. A symbol he had seen once before, back when he first started at the hospital, long before he had become a pathologist. A symbol linked to the occult, to forbidden practices that had been swept under the rug years ago. The hospital had been built on secrets. The morgue was just the surface. The shadowy figure of Dr. Harlow flickered in the corner of his vision, appearing just long enough for David to recognize the face, the twisted, grinning figure of his former colleague. "You were always supposed to find out," Harlow's voice echoed, low and haunting. It was never a mistake. The whispers, the bodies, the experiments, it was all leading to this. David's heart was pounding in his chest. He couldn't breathe, his vision blurred as the figures of the dead crowded around him, the morgue now alive with restless souls. The walls felt like they were closing in, squeezing the very life out of him. John Doe stepped forward, reaching out with cold, clammy hands. "Now you'll see the true purpose of your work, Dr. Miller. You'll see what we've all become." The morgue began to twist. The walls undulated. The dead were rising, no longer just bodies, but something else. David stumbled back, feeling himself drawn into the abyss. The whispering reached a deafening crescendo. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. His mouth opened, but the only thing he heard was the chant of the dead. "We are the cycle. We are the forgotten. We are the ones who never leave." And then the darkness consumed him. David's world went black. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing, just the deafening silence. The kind that seemed to press against his ears, suffocating him in the emptiness. He tried to move, but his limbs felt heavy, unresponsive. His chest felt tight, as if he were trapped in some kind of cold, suffocating vacuum. And then, slowly, the darkness began to lift. David's eyes flickered open. At first, the sight was blurred, his vision distorted, like he was seeing through water. But as the world around him came into focus, he realized he wasn't in the morgue anymore. He was lying in a bed, his own hospital bed. The sterile white sheets, the dim lighting, the persistent hum of machines. Everything was familiar, too familiar, but something was wrong. He felt different. His body felt heavier. His heart was beating in strange, erratic rhythms. His skin was cold. The air around him seemed charged with an eerie, unnatural energy. The whispers were back, and they weren't just in his head anymore. They filled the room, swirling around him like a storm. "You can't escape this. You are one of us now. Find the truth, David." David's breath quickened as his surroundings seemed to warp. The hospital room he was in was familiar, but it was also wrong. The walls seemed to pulse, as if they were alive. The monitors beside his bed beeped with an irregular, frantic rhythm. And then the heartbeat started. Slow at first, like a murmur beneath the floorboards, but it grew louder. Thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of a heart, but it wasn't his. It was everyone's heart. It was the heartbeat of the morgue, the heartbeat of the dead. David's eyes widened in terror as the whispers grew louder, converging into one unified cry. "You've awakened it." With trembling hands, David reached for the edge of the bed, trying to steady himself. His head spun, and the room seemed to tilt, as if gravity itself was shifting. He pushed himself upright, his body protesting with every movement, but he couldn't stop himself. He had to get out. He had to leave this place. The heartbeat thundered in his ears, the walls closing in, suffocating him. And then he heard it. A voice, soft, familiar. David's head snapped toward the door. The sound of his name sent a chill down his spine. The figure standing there was silhouetted in the dim light, but he knew who it was. He recognized the voice. It was Dr. Harlow. "You don't get to leave," Harlow's voice echoed, his form now becoming more tangible, more real. As he stepped forward into the room, his expression was cold, his eyes dark with something far deeper than malice. David recoiled, instinctively trying to push himself away from the bed. "This isn't real. You're dead. You've been gone for years." Dr. Harlow smiled, that twisted grin creeping across his face. "Am I dead, David? Or have I just transformed. David's stomach churned as the walls seemed to shift again. The heartbeat echoed louder now, rhythmic and unnatural, as if the hospital itself had become a living, breathing entity. Harlow's form wavered, like he wasn't fully in this dimension anymore. His presence felt cold, colder than the morgue itself. This place, Harlow continued, his voice barely a whisper, isn't just about death. It's about control, power. We've been using it, David, using the bodies, the minds, the souls, to keep everything moving, to keep everything alive. You can't leave because you're already a part of it. David's head was spinning. The hospital, the morgue, Harlow, all of it felt like a nightmare. The whispers, the bodies, the dead coming back to life, urging him forward. He tried to stand, to run, but the cold weight of the bed seemed to hold him in place, and the walls pressed in tighter. I know what you've been doing, David. Harlow's voice grew stronger, more insistent. You've been searching for the truth, but the truth doesn't matter here. Not anymore. The cycle has already begun, and you've already entered it. David opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. He was paralyzed, unable to speak, unable to act. The whispers were louder now, blending together into one chaotic chorus. No, I won't be a part of this, David finally managed, his voice shaky but defiant. Harlow's smile deepened. You already are. The walls around David seemed to distort once again, the heartbeat shaking him to his core, and then the room began to shift. The bed beneath him melted, and the floor disappeared. David was no longer in the hospital room. He was back in the morgue, surrounded by rows of bodies. The drawers were open now, each one containing a lifeless form. But there was something more, something alive about them. Their eyes flickered with an unnatural light. Their bodies twitched, their fingers curled. And then David realized it. He wasn't just in the morgue anymore. He was inside the hospital, the true heart of the place, the center of the cycle, the place where the dead didn't stay dead, the place where souls were trapped, forever bound to the walls of the hospital, feeding it, keeping it alive. David's breath caught in his throat as he turned to face the figure beside him. It was John Doe. He was alive, or at least he had been. His eyes met David's, and for the first time, the figure spoke. It's time, John Doe said, his voice hollow. You belong to us now, David, just like the others. We're all part of this. David gasped, his body trembling as the realization settled in. The dead weren't just waiting to be remembered. They were waiting for him to join them. And now, it was too late. David's head spun, his thoughts fractured as the whispers surged around him, overwhelming, suffocating. The shadows seemed to come alive, pressing in from all sides, and the cold air of the morgue gripped him tighter. He tried to move, but his body refused to cooperate. He felt as if invisible chains had locked him in place, tethering him to the hospital and to the endless cycle of death. John Doe's voice echoed in his mind. You belong to us now, David. The words were like daggers tearing through his resistance. He had spent so many years in this place, so many hours dissecting the dead. But now he understood. He wasn't an outsider anymore. The dead weren't just corpses waiting to be examined. They were active, alive in a way that defied reason. And now he was one of them. A part of the cycle, a part of the hospital that would never end. David's breath hitched, and the coldness around him intensified. The figures in the morgue, those bodies in the drawers, weren't just lifeless forms. They were watching him, waiting for him to join them. John Doe stepped closer, his eyes hollow, but there was a strange intensity in them. You're one of us now, Dr. Miller. You've seen it. You've uncovered it all. The hospital doesn't just heal, it traps. David's chest tightened. No, this isn't real. It can't be. But John Doe interrupted him, a cold smile forming on his lips. You've always known, David. Deep down, you've always known that the hospital doesn't just treat the sick. It feeds on them. It uses their bodies, their souls to survive. And now it's using you. David's eyes darted around the room, desperately searching for an escape. But the walls of the morgue seemed to stretch endlessly. There was no door, no window, just rows of bodies, all staring at him, waiting for him to accept the inevitable. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. They weren't just coming from John Doe anymore. The voices of the dead, of all those who had come and gone through the hospital's cold, sterile halls, filled the room. Join us. You can't leave now. You are part of the cycle. David's mind was spinning. The weight of the truth was crushing him. The morgue, the hospital. It wasn't a place for healing. It was a trap. A place where souls were bound, where the dead never truly left. And now, he was one of them. No, David shouted, struggling against the unseen forces that held him in place. I won't become like you. I won't. But the walls began to close in. The bodies in the morgue started to twitch. Their fingers moved, their eyes blinked, their lips parted in silent pleas. David could feel them. They were alive. Not fully, not in the way the living were, but they were aware. They were trapped here, just like him, and they wanted him to join them. David's vision blurred as the darkness took hold. The heartbeat, the one that had been echoing in his mind since the moment he entered the hospital, grew louder, faster. It was no longer just a sound. It was a presence, like the very foundation of the building was alive, pulsing with its own twisted rhythm. John Doe stepped forward, his cold fingers reaching out to touch David's arm. You can't escape this, David. You never could. We all belong here. You were never meant to leave. David screamed. The sound was raw, desperate, but it was drowned out by the overpowering heartbeat, by the deafening whispers, by the pull of the hospital's power. His body trembled, his limbs refusing to obey, as he was drawn into the center of the room. And then he saw it. The symbol, the same symbol he had seen in Dr. Harlow's files, the one marked on John Doe's body. It glowed faintly in the dark, etched into the very walls, the floor, the air around him, the cycle. It was everywhere. It's too late now, John Doe's voice echoed, his eyes darkening. You're part of the hospital's heartbeat now. You're part of us. Forever. David's breath caught in his throat as he felt the cold tendrils of the hospital wrap around him, pulling him deeper into its grip. His vision went black once again, and for the first time, he didn't resist. David's mind was slipping, the line between reality and nightmare becoming more and more indistinct. Every breath he took felt like it was coming from someone or something. The whispers in the morgue, the dead that moved and watched, and the relentless pulse of the hospital's heartbeat were suffocating him, drowning him in an ocean of his own confusion. He could feel the coldness of the room closing in. The bodies that surrounded him, so many of them, once patients, now mere shells of what they had been, seemed to be alive. Their eyes flickered, their limbs twitched. David could hear their silent cries for help. But they were no longer human. They were part of the cycle now, part of the hospital. David tried to move, but his legs felt like lead. His body was no longer his own. He could feel the weight of the hospital itself pressing down on him, pulling him toward the walls, toward the endless rows of bodies that were now awake. Every shadow seemed to carry the face of someone who had once been alive, and they were all waiting for him to understand. "You're one of us now, David," a voice said. This time not from John Doe, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere older. It was a voice he didn't recognize, but it felt familiar, like it had always been there, watching him. The voice filled his ears, his mind, drowning out everything else. "The hospital is alive, David. It has always been alive, and you are part of it." David's vision blurred again, and he could feel his thoughts unraveling. The truth, the horrible, twisted truth, was clear now. He wasn't just trapped in the hospital, he was the hospital. The morgue, the bodies, the souls, they were all connected to him, connected to the heart of this place. "You've always been part of the cycle," the voice continued, growing louder. "You were chosen, David. The moment you entered these halls, you became one of us. You were meant to understand the power we hold, the power to keep the dead alive." David's heart was racing, but his body felt heavy, numb. He couldn't escape. There was no way out. Suddenly he saw it, a vision of Dr. Harlow, standing before him, his face twisted in a cruel smile. But it wasn't just Harlow anymore. Behind him, David saw the faces of the dead, patients who had disappeared years ago, who had become part of the hospital's dark existence. "I created this," Dr. Harlow's voice echoed, filling the space around David. "I created this place, this cycle. The hospital doesn't just treat the living, it feeds on them, and it feeds on you now." David tried to scream, but no sound came out. His mouth opened, but he was suffocating on the truth. The truth of what the hospital had become, what he had become. He wasn't just a pathologist. He wasn't just a man doing his job. He was part of the twisted, endless system that kept the dead alive, that fed on their souls. The bodies, they never leave. The whispering voices continued. "They stay here, in the cycle. And you will too, David. Forever." He collapsed to his knees, his hands gripping the cold, smooth floor of the morgue. The walls seemed to pulse in time with the heartbeat, with the rhythm of the hospital itself. The morgue had become his prison, his home, his eternal existence. There was no escape from this place, no way to outrun the truth. "The dead never leave," the voice of Dr. Harlow repeated, his form fading into the shadows. "They remain, and now you remain too." David felt himself being pulled toward the walls, his body giving in to the weight of the hospital's power. He wasn't alive, he wasn't dead, he was part of the cycle. The whispers filled his mind, drowning out everything else, until there was nothing left but the endless pulse of the hospital, the heartbeat that would never stop. David's mind was unraveling, his thoughts fading like mist before the sun. He couldn't tell where his body ended and the hospital began. The whispers that had once been distant voices from the dead were now his thoughts, his own voice caught in the loop of the morgue's endless cycle. He could feel it now, his heartbeat, slow and steady, resonating with the rhythm of the hospital. The walls hummed with it, the machinery pulsed with it, and he was just another cog in the machine. He wasn't a doctor anymore. He wasn't even a man. He was part of the cycle. He was part of the hospital. The room around him shifted, distorting into something darker. The walls seemed to ripple, like the flesh of some grotesque creature, its heartbeat vibrating through the floor, through the ceiling. The bodies in the morgue, once still and lifeless, now twitched, their eyes wide open, staring at him. They weren't dead, not completely. They were alive in the worst possible way. Trapped, the whispers were louder now, their urgency growing. They were everywhere, surrounding him, drowning him in their cold, suffocating presence. It's time to accept it. David, you are the heart of the cycle now. You're one of us. David's vision blurred, and he staggered, his legs unable to hold him. He reached out to steady himself on one of the morgue tables, but his hand passed right through the cold metal. The table was no longer solid. It was alive. He could feel it, the pulsing of the dead inside, the breath of the lost souls trapped within. "Stop fighting it," the voice of John Doe whispered, his hollow eyes locked onto David's. "You're part of us, forever. The dead never leave, and neither do you." David clutched his head, trying to push away the flood of thoughts crashing into him. He could feel his identity slipping, dissolving like smoke. There was no escape, no way back to the life he had once known. The whispering voices seemed to echo from every corner of the hospital now, not just from the morgue, but from every room, every hallway, every body, every soul that had ever passed through the hospital's doors. The cycle will never end. The voice of Dr. Harlow echoed in his mind. "We made sure of it. We made sure you would never leave." David stumbled toward the door, his hands trembling. He couldn't breathe. His chest felt tight, his skin icy cold. But the door was just ahead. It was so close. He reached for the handle, pulling it open. But instead of stepping into the familiar hallways of the hospital, he was met with darkness. The hospital had shifted again. The hallway he had expected was gone. In its place, there was a vast, endless void, like the bowels of the earth itself, a place where time had no meaning. It was the same place he had seen before, the center of the hospital, the very heart of it. "Welcome to the end." A voice, one that wasn't his, whispered. It came from all around him, inside him, as if it was part of his own mind. "This is the place where the dead come to rest. But they don't rest, not really. They feed, they linger, they live." David turned around, eyes wide with terror. The door behind him had vanished, and now there was no escape, no way back to what was real. "There's nothing left for you out there, David." John Doe's voice came again. "You belong to the hospital now. You always have." David staggered back, feeling the walls close in. The figures of the dead gathered around him, their hollow eyes watching, waiting. He was no longer a man. He was no longer Dr. David Miller. He was part of the hospital, a part of the cycle that would never end. "We are the cycle," the voices murmured. "We are the heartbeat of the hospital. We are the dead who never leave." David collapsed to his knees, his body trembling as the weight of it all pressed down on him. He wasn't alive. He wasn't dead. He was caught somewhere in between, an endless loop of life and death with no end in sight. The hospital had taken him, just as it had taken so many others before him, and now he was one of them. David's mind, now fully engulfed in the hospital's twisted cycle, drifted in and out of consciousness, his sense of self slipping further with each passing moment. The endless whispers continued to surround him, growing louder, more insistent, like a chorus of the dead, calling from the very depths of the hospital. They echoed through his mind, through his soul. "You can't run from us, David. You never could." His body was no longer his own. His movements were mechanical, as if guided by invisible strings. He wasn't a man anymore. He wasn't a pathologist. He was part of the hospital, a cog in its never-ending machine. His once pristine white coat now felt like a shroud, weighing him down. The dead around him weren't just lingering, they were alive. They were waiting. He reached out, his hands trembling, and touched one of the morgue drawers. The metal was cold, but as he made contact, he felt it, a pulse, a heartbeat, slow and steady, beating from within the walls of the morgue. It was a sound he had heard before, but now it was different. It was louder, clearer. It was his heart, the hospital's heart. The walls of the morgue seemed to ripple as if they were alive, breathing, pulsing in time with the rhythm of the dead. David stepped back, eyes wide, fear seizing him once again. This was no ordinary hospital. It was alive. It fed on the dead, on the souls trapped within it. And now, it had fed on him. "We are the pulse of this place," John Doe's voice whispered from behind him, calm and unsettling. "We are its heart, and now you are too." David couldn't respond. He couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The weight of the truth, the suffocating pressure of it, was unbearable. He was the hospital. He had always been a part of it. The moment he had stepped through those doors, he had been claimed, just like all the others who had come before him. He turned, trying to focus on something, anything, but there was nothing. No escape. Just the endless rows of bodies, all of them staring at him, their eyes wide open, their souls awake. "You've seen what happens to us," a voice from one of the drawers said, slow and deliberate. "We don't die here. Not really. We just become. And you will too." David staggered back, his hand reaching for the table beside him, but it slipped through his fingers. His world was warping, twisting around him. The hospital was shifting again. He could feel it, its pulse, its rhythm. It wasn't just the heartbeat of the morgue anymore. It was the heartbeat of the entire hospital. The dead, the living, they were all part of it, now. "We are the ones who never leave," a voice whispered, closer now. "We are the ones who feed the heart of this place." David's mind snapped back to the present. He could feel his body beginning to change. He was no longer a man. He was becoming part of something far older, something far darker. The heartbeat grew louder, filling his chest with the sound of the dead, the living, the hospital's eternal pulse. "You're not a doctor anymore, David," John Doe said, his voice cold. "You're not a man. You're part of the cycle now. Just like me, just like them." David's breathing grew shallow. His body felt like it was being pulled apart, but there was no pain. Just a deep, overwhelming sense of knowing. This was the truth. This was the reality of the hospital. A place where the dead never truly died. A place where souls were trapped, twisted into something else. The walls around him shifted again, growing darker, closing in. The shadows were no longer just darkness. They were alive. The figures of the dead moved, their bodies twitching, as if they were finally waking up, rising from their resting places. "We were the first," John Doe's voice echoed. "But you will be the last to understand, the last to join us." David's heart seemed to beat in sync with the dead now. The pulse was relentless, thumping in his chest like a drum, growing louder, faster. His hands began to twitch, his fingers curling into fists. The whispers were inside him now, his own thoughts merging with theirs, a continuous loop of the dead, calling out, urging him to join them. "It's time, David," a new voice said. This time it was Dr. Harlow, but he wasn't standing in front of him. He wasn't even there in the room. It was as if Harlow's voice was coming from the very walls of the hospital, from the very heartbeat that now filled David's body. You've become part of the cycle. Welcome to your eternity." David's eyes fluttered shut, and the world around him seemed to disappear. The darkness wasn't just black, it was endless, stretching far beyond the hospital, far beyond the morgue. It was the endless loop of life and death, a cycle that had no beginning, and David was part of it now, just as Harlow had intended. The hospital had claimed him, and now David Miller would never leave.